13-year-old laughs in court after killing both parents. Judge delivers most brutal sentence ever. 13 years old. That's how young she was when she sat in that courtroom laughing. Not crying, not trembling, laughing. The prosecutor described how she had taken the life of the woman who gave her life, her own mother, and the girl giggled like someone had told her a joke at a sleepover. The jury stared in disbelief. The victim's family clutched each other, shattered by what they were witnessing. She had pulled the trigger not once, not twice, but 3 times. Then she had texted her friends, inviting them over as if nothing had happened. She believed her age would be her shield. She thought the system would see a child and show mercy. But the judge sitting behind that bench had seen monsters before, and he was about to deliver a sentence so brutal, so absolute, that it would echo through courtrooms across the nation for years to come. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now and tell us what you think below. The morning had started like any other in that quiet Mississippi suburb. The lawns were trimmed. The birds sang their ignorant songs. Inside one particular home, a mother named Ashley Smiley was getting ready for another day of shaping young minds as an educator. She had dedicated her life to her students, her community, and most of all, her family. Her husband Heath adored her. Their neighbors envied the warmth that seemed to radiate from their household. But behind closed doors, a storm had been brewing for months. A storm no one could see. A storm wearing the face of a child. There had been arguments about hidden behavior, discoveries of things a 13-year-old should never have been involved with, text messages that revealed a secret world Ashley was desperately trying to pull her daughter back from. She thought she was saving her child. She had no idea she was walking toward her own grave. That morning, the girl found her mother's firearm. She knew exactly where it was kept. She knew exactly how to use it. And in the span of a few heartbeats, she made a choice that would destroy everything. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, every breath held. Reporters clutched their notebooks with white knuckles, unsure if what they were witnessing was real or some twisted nightmare dressed in legal proceedings. At the center of it all sat a girl who had not yet lived long enough to drive a car, vote, or understand the full weight of consequences. Yet here she was, charged with the most unthinkable crime a child could commit. She had taken the life of her own mother, the woman who had carried her, named her, loved her through every stumble and triumph. And as the prosecutor began recounting the details of that horrific morning, the girl did something that made the entire room freeze. She laughed. It was not a nervous laugh. It was not the awkward release of tension that sometimes escapes people in moments of unbearable stress. No, this was something else entirely. It was a giggle. Light, dismissive, almost amused, the kind of sound you might hear at a birthday party or during a comedy show. But this was no party. This was a murder trial, and the sound that escaped her lips sent a chill down the spine of every person present. Jurors exchanged glances of pure disbelief. The victim's family members visibly recoiled, fresh tears streaming down faces already raw from grief. How could she laugh? How could any human being find humor in the recounting of their own mother's final moments? The prosecutor paused, visibly shaken but determined to continue. He described the crime scene with clinical precision, painting a picture so vivid that several audience members had to look away. 3 gunshots. That was all it had taken. 3 pulls of a trigger, and a mother's life was extinguished forever. Ashley Smiley had been found in her own home, in a space that should have been her sanctuary. The daughter she had raised, protected, and fought for had become her executioner. There was no intruder, no stranger, just a child with a weapon and a heart seemingly emptied of all human connection. The prosecutor's voice trembled slightly as he continued, but his words carried the weight of absolute certainty. Behind the defense table, attorneys shuffled papers and whispered urgently to one another. Their strategy was already clear to anyone paying attention. They would argue that this was not a monster, but a sick child, a girl battling demons no one could see. Mental illness, they would claim, had hijacked her mind and turned her into something unrecognizable. It was an argument as old as criminal law itself, the question of whether a broken mind could excuse broken actions. But as the girl continued to smirk and shift in her seat with apparent boredom, even the most sympathetic observers found themselves questioning that narrative. Could illness alone explain this level of detachment, this complete absence of remorse? The judge watched from his elevated position, his face an unreadable mask of authority. He had presided over countless cases in his career. He had seen violence in its many forms, heard confessions revelations that would haunt ordinary people for lifetimes. But something about this case was different. Something about this defendant unsettled him in a way he had not experienced before. She was so young, so small in that oversized chair, and yet the coldness radiating from her felt ancient, almost practiced. He made a mental note to himself. This trial would require every ounce of his judicial wisdom. The eyes of the nation were watching, and the decision he would eventually render would shape conversations about juvenile justice for generations to come. In the gallery, Ashley's family sat huddled together like survivors of a shipwreck. Her husband Heath stared straight ahead, his eyes hollow, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Friends who had known Ashley for decades wept quietly, still unable to reconcile the vibrant woman they loved with the lifeless body described in court documents. They had come seeking answers, seeking some explanation that might make sense of the senseless. But watching the defendant giggle and whisper to her attorneys, they found only more questions, more pain, more rage at a universe that could allow such a thing to happen. Their Ashley deserved better. She deserved a daughter who mourned her, not one who mocked her memory. As the first day of testimony drew to a close, the courtroom began to empty slowly, but the weight of what had transpired lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. Outside, news cameras captured every face, every tear, every expression of shock and outrage. The story was already spreading across the nation, igniting debates about youth, violence, and accountability. And somewhere in a holding cell, a 13-year-old girl waited for tomorrow, seemingly unbothered by the storm she had created. She had no idea that the evidence mounting against her was about to become overwhelming. She had no idea that her smirks would soon be silenced forever, before the blood, before the gunshots, before the nightmare became reality. There was a family that looked like any other in their quiet Mississippi suburb, the kind of neighborhood where people waved at each other from their driveways, and children rode bicycles until the streetlights flickered on. Lawns were mowed with pride. Mailboxes stood in neat rows, and behind the doors of one particular home lived Ashley Smiley, a woman whose warmth could fill any room she entered. She was a mother, a wife, an educator who had dedicated her life to shaping young minds. Her students adored her, her colleagues respected her, and her family was everything to her. No one walking past that house could have imagined what was brewing inside its walls. Ashley had married Heath with the kind of love that poets write about. They had built their life together brick by brick, dream by dream. Weekend barbecues with neighbors, holiday gatherings that stretched late into the night with laughter and gratitude. Friends described them as the couple everyone wanted to be, supportive, communicative, genuinely happy. Heath worked hard to provide for his family, and Ashley matched his dedication with her tireless commitment to their home and her career. They were partners in every sense of the word. When challenges arose, they faced them together. When joys appeared, they celebrated as one. Their love was not perfect, but it was real. It was the kind of love that should have lasted decades more. Their daughter had been the center of their universe from the moment she was born. Every milestone celebrated, every achievement applauded. Ashley poured herself into motherhood with the same passion she brought to teaching. She attended every school event, helped with every homework assignment, stayed up late during every childhood illness. She believed in her daughter with a faith that only mothers truly understand. Even when the teenage years brought challenges, Ashley refused to give up. She saw potential where others might have seen problems. She saw hope where shadows were beginning to form. She loved her daughter unconditionally, never imagining that this love would one day cost her everything she had. But something had begun to change in recent months. The bright-eyed child Ashley had raised was becoming someone unrecognizable. There were arguments about hidden behaviors that Ashley discovered by accident. Text messages on secret phones, conversations about substances no 13-year-old should know about. Ashley confronted her daughter repeatedly, trying to pull her back from the edge of a cliff she could sense but not fully see. She grounded her. She monitored her. She did everything a concerned mother was supposed to do. Each intervention was met with resistance, with anger, with a coldness that grew sharper by the day. Ashley told friends she was worried. She told Heath they needed to try harder. She never told anyone she was afraid. The night before the tragedy, the house had been quiet. Heath remembered later that dinner had been uneventful. A few words exchanged, plates cleared, doors closed. He had kissed Ashley goodnight without knowing it would be their last kiss. She had smiled at him without knowing she would never smile again. In her daughter's room, behind a locked door, something dark was taking final shape. Plans were being made. Decisions were being finalized. The girl who had once been Ashley's greatest joy was about to become her greatest horror. And as the house settled into sleep, none of them sensed the monster waiting in the shadows of the morning to come. Friends would later describe the shock as physical, like being punched in the chest without warning. Ashley was the last person anyone expected to die violently. She was kindness personified, the woman who brought soup to sick neighbors and stayed late to tutor struggling students. Her death seemed like a mistake, a cosmic error that the universe would surely correct if given the chance. But there was no correction. There was only the brutal truth that someone so good could be erased so suddenly, so senselessly. The community that had known her for years found themselves grasping for explanations that did not exist. Some cried, some raged, all of them mourned a light that had been extinguished far too soon. That morning, as the sun rose over the quiet suburb, a neighbor received a text message that would haunt them forever. The words were simple, almost casual, but behind them lay a horror beyond comprehension. Within hours, police cars would flood the street. Yellow tape would mark the boundaries of tragedy, and a community that had believed itself safe would learn that evil does not always come from strangers in the night. Sometimes it grows in the room next door. Sometimes it wears the face of a child. And sometimes, by the time anyone realizes the truth, it is already far too late to save the ones we love. The morning of the tragedy began with sunlight streaming through windows like any other day. Birds sang outside. The smell of coffee lingered in the kitchen. It was the kind of ordinary morning that families across America experience without a second thought. But inside that Mississippi home, ordinary was about to be shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Ashley Smiley moved through her morning routine, unaware that these would be her final moments. She had plans for the day, lessons to prepare, a life to continue living. She had no idea that her daughter had already made a different plan, a plan that had been forming in the darkness for longer than anyone would ever know. The weapon had been kept in the master bedroom, a .357 Magnum purchased for protection, stored where Ashley believed it was safe. She had never imagined it would be used against her. She had never imagined that the hands reaching for it that morning would belong to her own child. But that is exactly what happened. While the house still held the quiet of early hours, the girl retrieved the firearm with a calm that investigators would later describe as chilling. There was no hesitation, no trembling, just a cold, methodical purpose that defied her young age. She knew where it was, she knew how to use it, and she knew exactly what she was about to do. The first shot shattered the silence like thunder. Ashley had no time to react, no time to understand what was happening. The second shot followed almost immediately, erasing any possibility of survival. And then a third, as if to ensure that the job was complete. 3 bullets, 3 explosive sounds that ended a mother's life and destroyed a family forever. The forensic team would later reconstruct the trajectory of each round, mapping the angles with scientific precision. Their reports painted a picture of close-range execution. There was no struggle, no defensive wounds. Ashley had been taken completely by surprise by the person she trusted most in the world. Heath was not in the house when the first shots were fired at Ashley, but he would soon become a target himself. When he encountered the situation, the girl turned the weapon toward him as well. A bullet struck his shoulder, sending him crashing to the ground in agony and disbelief. Through the searing pain, he managed to call for help, his voice breaking as he tried to comprehend the incomprehensible. His stepdaughter had just tried to end his life. The same girl he had helped raise, had provided for, had treated as his own. Now she stood over him with a smoking gun and eyes that held nothing resembling remorse. He would survive his wound, but the psychological scars would never fully heal. What happened next defied all logic. Instead of calling for help, instead of showing any sign of panic or regret, the girl picked up her phone and began texting friends. Her messages were casual, almost cheerful. She invited them to come over, to see her mother, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. Investigators would later recover these texts and present them as evidence of her disturbing mental state. She had just committed the ultimate act of violence, and her response was to plan a social gathering. The disconnect between action and reaction was so profound that even seasoned detectives struggled to process it. This was not the behavior of someone who had acted in a moment moment of passion. This was something else entirely. When the first responders arrived, they found a scene that would haunt them for years. The smell of gunpowder still hung heavy in the air. Ashley's body lay where she had fallen, surrounded by evidence of a life violently interrupted. Family photographs lined the walls, frozen smiles mocking the tragedy below. The responding officers secured the scene with trembling hands, many of them parents themselves, unable to stop imagining their own children in such a scenario. One veteran officer later admitted he had to step outside to compose himself. In 20 years on the force, he had never encountered anything quite like this. The brutality was shocking enough. The age of the perpetrator made it almost unbearable. The lead investigator arrived within the hour, his face grim as he surveyed the carnage. He walked through the house slowly, taking mental notes of every detail: the position of the weapon, the location of shell casings, the undisturbed state of doors and windows confirming there had been no intruder. Everything pointed to a single horrible conclusion. This was not a random act of violence. This was not a home invasion gone wrong. This was a daughter ending her mother's life with premeditated precision. As he stood in that blood-stained room, the investigator made a silent promise. He would build a case so airtight that justice would be unavoidable. And somewhere in that house, a phone held messages time-stamped just minutes after the final shot. Messages that would prove the killer felt nothing at all. The investigation began within hours of the first responders securing the scene. Detectives descended upon the quiet suburb like surgeons entering an operating room, methodical, focused, and acutely aware that every detail mattered. The lead investigator coordinated his team with practiced efficiency, assigning tasks and establishing protocols that would ensure no evidence was overlooked. Phone records were subpoenaed immediately. Geolocation data was requested from cellular providers. The 911 call that Heath had made from the floor, bleeding and broken, was analyzed for every word, every pause, every tremor in his voice. A timeline was already taking shape, and with each passing hour, it painted a picture of calculated violence that left no room for accident or mistake. The security footage became the prosecution's most damning asset. Cameras positioned throughout the property had captured movements that the defendant never expected anyone to see. Investigators watched in grim silence as the footage revealed the girl retrieving the weapon from her mother's room. There was no panic in her steps, no looking over her shoulder. She moved with a purpose that suggested she had rehearsed this moment in her mind many times before. The timestamp on the video aligned perfectly with the estimated time of the attack, and in the minutes following the gunshots, the same cameras showed her calmly walking through the house, checking her phone, behaving as if the body cooling in the other room meant nothing at all. Ballistics experts arrived to collect and analyze the physical evidence. Shell casings were recovered from the scene, each one tagged and photographed with meticulous care. The .357 Magnum was secured for testing, its barrel still carrying the residue of its deadly purpose. When the ballistics report came back, it confirmed what investigators already suspected. The casings matched the weapon found in the home. The trajectory of each bullet aligned with the position of the victim. There was no second shooter, no alternative explanation. The science was absolute, and it pointed directly at the 13-year-old girl who had pulled the trigger without hesitation or mercy. As detectives dug deeper, they discovered signs of evidence tampering that elevated the case from tragedy to calculated horror. Certain items in the house had been moved after the attack, positions altered, potential evidence hidden or rearranged. It became clear that the defendant had attempted to manipulate the scene to create confusion that might cast doubt on her guilt, but she had underestimated the thoroughness of modern forensic investigation. Every adjustment she made left traces. Every attempt to cover her tracks only added another layer to the mountain of proof building against her. The investigators documented each discrepancy, knowing that in the courtroom, these details would speak louder than any witness testimony. The text messages recovered from the defendant's phone became a window into a mind that defied comprehension. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, she had reached out to friends with invitations to visit. Her words were casual, even playful, as if she were planning an ordinary afternoon hangout. She asked them to come see her mother, offering no hint of what they would actually find. When these friends later spoke with investigators, their trauma was palpable. They had arrived expecting nothing unusual and walked into a nightmare that would reshape their their young lives forever. The defendant had used them as unwitting props in her twisted performance, showing no regard for the psychological damage she would inflict. Early signals of instability had been documented long before the attack, though their significance was only understood in hindsight. School counselors had flagged concerning behaviors. A psychological evaluation had been recommended months earlier due to mood irregularities and troubling statements. The pieces of a broken psyche were scattered across reports and files that no one had connected until it was too late. Now, these documents became part of the investigation, offering context for a crime that seemed to defy all logic. Mental health professionals would later debate whether intervention could have prevented this tragedy, but for the investigators focused on the present, the past only mattered as evidence of a pattern leading inexorably toward violence. The lead detective held a briefing with his team as the first week of investigation drew to a close. The evidence was overwhelming. The timeline was airtight. The forensic science left no room for reasonable doubt. But as he dismissed his officers, one of them approached with a discovery that would add yet another layer to an already disturbing case. A second phone message had been uncovered, one that suggested the defendant had not acted entirely on impulse. The contents of that message would soon be revealed in court, and when they were, even those who thought they understood the depths of this horror would find themselves facing something far darker than they had imagined. Who was this girl before she became a killer? That question haunted everyone connected to the case. Investigators, prosecutors, even the defense attorneys found themselves searching for answers in a past that seemed to offer no clear warnings. She had no history of violence, no juvenile record, no incidents that would have placed her on any watch list or triggered mandatory intervention. By all outward appearances, she had been an ordinary teenager navigating the turbulent waters of adolescence. She attended school, she had friends, she participated in activities that any parent would consider normal. Yet somewhere beneath that ordinary surface, something profoundly broken had been growing, something that remained invisible until it exploded into unimaginable violence. The psychological evaluations conducted after her arrest painted a complex and troubling portrait. Mental health professionals diagnosed her with bipolar disorder, a condition characterized by extreme mood swings that could range from manic highs to crushing lows. Medications had been prescribed at various points, though questions arose about whether she had been taking them consistently. Her attorneys seized upon these findings as the foundation of their defense strategy. They argued that her mental state at the time of the attack had been compromised beyond her control. She was not a monster, they insisted, but a sick child failed by a system that should have provided better care. It was an argument designed to evoke sympathy where rage seemed the only natural response, but the prosecution saw the psychological evidence through an entirely different lens. Yes, she had been diagnosed with mental health issues. Yes, she had struggled with mood regulation and impulse control, but millions of people lived with similar conditions without ever harming another human being. The question was not whether she was troubled, but whether her troubles excused the deliberate taking of a life. Prosecutors pointed to the calculated nature of the crime, the retrieval of the weapon, the multiple shots, the calm behavior afterward, as proof that this was not a psychotic break, but a premeditated act. Mental illness might explain some behaviors, they argued, but it could not erase accountability for cold-blooded violence. The contrast between her childhood photographs and her courtroom demeanor became a focal point of public fascination. In pictures from just a few years earlier, she appeared bright-eyed and innocent, smiling at birthday parties and school events like any other child. Teachers remembered her as quiet but capable. Classmates recalled nothing particularly alarming about her presence. Yet the girl sitting in court bore almost no resemblance to those memories. She smirked when testimony described her mother's final moments. She giggled at inappropriate times, drawing gasps from spectators and stern warnings from the judge. The transformation seemed impossible, as if two entirely different people were being discussed in the same proceedings. Her behavior during the trial became almost as controversial as the crime itself. Legal analysts debated whether her smirks and eye rolls were symptoms of genuine mental illness or calculated attempts to appear unstable. Some psychiatrists suggested that her emotional detachment could indicate a disconnect from reality, a dissociative state that prevented her from fully processing the gravity of her situation. Others argued that she was playing a role designed to support the insanity defense her attorneys were constructing. The truth remained elusive, buried beneath layers layers of clinical jargon and competing interpretations. What everyone could agree on was that her demeanor made it nearly impossible for the jury to feel sympathy. Family members who testified struggled to reconcile the girl they had known with the defendant before them. Relatives described a child who had once been loving, if occasionally moody. They spoke of warning signs that seemed minor at the time: increased isolation, secretive phone usage, flashes of inexplicable anger. In hindsight, these moments took on sinister significance, but in the moment, they had seemed like typical teenage behavior, nothing that warranted serious alarm. The guilt of not seeing the danger ate at them visibly as they spoke. They had loved her, they had trusted her, and now they were forced to confront the reality that someone they cherished had committed an act beyond comprehension. As the psychological testimony continued, the court awaited the appearance of a key expert witness. A psychiatrist who had evaluated the defendant extensively was scheduled to take the stand, and rumors circulated that his findings would be pivotal. Both sides had prepared extensively for his testimony, knowing that his conclusions could shift the entire trajectory of the trial. When he finally entered the courtroom and took his oath, the air seemed to thicken with anticipation. He opened his folder slowly, glanced at the defendant, and began to speak. What he revealed in the next hour would challenge everything both the prosecution and defense had assumed, and it would force the jury to confront a question with no easy answer: where does illness end and evil begin? The courtroom had transformed into a theater of justice where every seat held a witness to history. Cameras lined the back wall, their lenses focused on the proceedings with unblinking attention. Journalists filled the press section, notebooks ready, recorders running, each one aware they were documenting a case that would be discussed for decades. Spectators who had arrived hours early claimed the remaining seats, their faces reflecting a mixture of morbid curiosity and genuine outrage. The atmosphere was electric, charged with tension that seemed to vibrate in the very walls, and at the center of it all sat a 13-year-old girl whose apparent indifference to the gravity of her situation only intensified the collective disbelief. The prosecution opened with a statement designed to leave no room for ambiguity. The lead prosecutor stood tall, his voice steady but weighted with the responsibility of speaking for the dead. He described Ashley Smiley not as a statistic, but as a human being, a mother who loved fiercely, a teacher who inspired generations, a woman whose life was stolen by the very person she had given life to. He walked the jury through the crime with surgical precision, each detail building upon the last to construct an unassailable narrative of premeditated violence. The weapon retrieved without hesitation, the shots fired at close range, the calm behavior that followed. He painted a picture of a defendant who knew exactly what she was doing and chose to do it anyway. When the defense rose to deliver their opening statement, the contrast was immediate and intentional. The lead defense attorney spoke softly, almost sorrowfully, as if mourning the tragedy from a different angle. She acknowledged that Ashley Smiley had died. She acknowledged the horror of the circumstances, but she asked the jury to look deeper, to see beyond the surface of the crime to the broken child who had committed it. Mental illness, she argued, had hijacked her client's mind. Bipolar disorder, possible psychosis, a perfect storm of chemical imbalances and untreated symptoms that had culminated in an act her client could not control. The girl at the defense table was not a monster, she insisted. She was a victim of her own malfunctioning brain. As the defense attorney spoke, something happened that made the entire courtroom freeze. The defendant giggled. It was soft at first, barely audible, but in the silence of the court, it resonated like a thunderclap. Heads turned. Jurors exchanged glances of pure disbelief. The defense attorney faltered mid-sentence, her composure cracking for just a moment before she regained control. But the damage was done. The jury had witnessed a girl laughing during a description of her own mother's violent end. Whatever sympathy the defense had been trying to build evaporated in that single devastating moment. The giggle seemed to confirm what many already suspected. This was not a child overwhelmed by illness, but something far more disturbing. In the gallery, Ashley's family reacted with visible anguish. Heath sat rigid, his wounded shoulder still healing, his eyes fixed on the girl who had nearly ended his life as well. Beside him, Ashley's siblings wept openly, their grief compounded by the cruelty of watching the defendant show no remorse. Friends who had traveled from across the state to support the family clutched each other's hands, their faces masks of horror and heartbreak. They had come seeking closure, hoping that the trial might offer some path toward healing. healing. Instead, they found themselves confronted with a defendant whose behavior seemed designed to maximize their pain. Every smirk was a fresh wound. Every giggle was salt poured into injuries that might never heal. The judge intervened with a sharpness that silenced the murmurs rippling through the courtroom. He leaned forward, his gaze fixed on the defendant with an intensity that demanded attention. His words were measured, but carried unmistakable authority. He reminded everyone present that this was a court of law, not a spectacle for entertainment. He warned the defendant directly that her behavior would be noted and could influence proceedings in ways she might not anticipate. The girl's smile faded slightly, though whether from genuine understanding or mere performance remained impossible to determine. The judge's intervention restored order, but it also underscored a troubling reality. This trial would be as much about the defendant's demeanor as it would be about the evidence. As the first day of formal testimony drew to a close, observers debated what they had witnessed. Was the defendant's laughter a symptom of genuine mental illness, a disconnect from reality that prevented her from processing the situation appropriately? Or was it something more calculated, an attempt to appear unstable in support of the insanity defense? Legal experts would argue both sides in the days to come. But for the jury tasked with determining her fate, the question was not academic. They would have to decide whether to believe in illness or intent. And as they filed out for the evening, the judge made a quiet observation to his clerk. Psychiatric defenses had their limits under the law, and those limits might soon become very relevant indeed. The evidence phase of the trial began with a methodical precision that left no detail unexplored. Prosecutors had spent months preparing for this moment, assembling a case so comprehensive that each piece of evidence reinforced the next like links in an unbreakable chain. The jury sat in focused attention as exhibit after exhibit was introduced, each one adding weight to the narrative of premeditated violence. Defense attorneys objected frequently, attempting to slow the momentum building against their client, but the judge overruled most challenges, allowing the prosecution to present their case with minimal interruption. The truth was emerging, one documented fact at a time, and nothing the defense said could stop it. The security camera footage was played for the courtroom in devastating detail. Frame by frame, the jury watched the defendant move through her home on the morning of the attack. The timestamp in the corner of the screen served as a silent witness, marking each moment with undeniable precision. They saw her enter her mother's bedroom, her movements calm and deliberate. They saw her retrieve the weapon from its storage location, handling it with a familiarity that suggested practice. There was no hesitation in her steps, no looking back. She walked toward her fate and her mother's doom with the steady gait of someone who had already made peace with what was about to happen. When the footage ended, silence filled the courtroom like a physical presence. Text message logs were displayed on screens positioned throughout the room, allowing every juror and spectator to read the words the defendant had typed in the aftermath of the crime. The messages were chilling in their casualness. She had invited friends to come over, using language that suggested nothing unusual had occurred. One message even included a cheerful emoji, a small digital symbol that now seemed grotesque in context. Prosecutors highlighted the timestamps, showing that these invitations were sent within minutes of the final gunshot. The defendant had not called for help. She had not expressed shock or regret. She had reached for her phone and begun planning social activities while her mother's body lay nearby. The disconnect was almost impossible to comprehend. A forensic pathologist took the stand to explain the physical evidence recovered from Ashley Smiley's body. His testimony was clinical but devastating, describing wound patterns and bullet trajectories with scientific detachment. Each of the 3 shots had been fired at close range, indicating that the victim and shooter had been in immediate proximity. The angle of entry suggested Ashley had been facing her attacker, perhaps in the midst of a conversation when the first trigger pull shattered everything. The pathologist confirmed that any one of the 3 wounds could have been fatal on its own. The defendant had not stopped after incapacitating her mother. She had continued firing until survival was impossible. It was not an accident. It was an execution. The defense attempted to redirect the narrative during cross-examination, focusing on the defendant's mental state rather than the physical evidence. They questioned whether a child suffering from untreated mental illness could truly form the intent necessary for premeditated violence. They suggested that the calm behavior captured on camera might actually indicate dissociation, a psychological response to trauma rather than cold calculation. But the prosecution prosecution was ready with rebuttals that dismantled each argument. They presented the timeline of events, showing the deliberate steps the defendant had taken before, during, and after the attack. They emphasized the text messages, the evidence tampering, the complete absence of any attempt to seek help. Intent was written into every action she had taken. The emotional peak of the day came when Heath took the stand to recount his own encounter with violence. His voice trembled as he described the moment he realized what was happening. The gunshot that struck his shoulder, the pain that exploded through his body, the incomprehensible sight of his stepdaughter holding the weapon that had just wounded him. He had collapsed to the floor, bleeding and terrified, somehow finding the strength to call for help while uncertain if he would survive. Tears streamed down his face as he spoke, and several jurors wiped their own eyes in response. Here was a man who had loved this girl as his own, who had helped raise her, who had opened his home and heart to her, and she had tried to end his life without apparent hesitation. As Heath's testimony concluded, the prosecution announced they had one final piece of evidence to introduce before the day ended. A recorded voicemail had been recovered from the defendant's phone, a message left in the days before the attack that suggested the violence was not impulsive but planned. The courtroom stirred with anticipation as the technical team prepared to play the recording. Defense attorneys huddled urgently, clearly caught off guard by this development. When the audio finally played through the courtroom speakers, the defendant's voice filled the room, and what she had said in that message would change everything the jury thought they understood about this case. The prosecutor rose for his closing arguments with the weight of justice resting on his shoulders. He had spent weeks building toward this moment, layering evidence upon evidence until the case against the defendant seemed unassailable. Now he stood before the jury, his voice carrying the conviction of absolute certainty. He reminded them of everything they had witnessed, the security footage showing a calm, deliberate retrieval of the murder weapon, the text messages sent minutes after the attack, casual and chilling in equal measure, the forensic evidence confirming close-range execution, the voicemail suggesting premeditation. He wove these elements together into a narrative that left no room for reasonable doubt. This was not a tragedy of mental illness. This was a calculated act of violence by a defendant who knew exactly what she was doing. He spoke of Ashley Smiley with a reverence that filled the courtroom with renewed grief. He described her not as a victim in a legal case, but as a mother, a teacher, a woman whose life had been dedicated to nurturing others. She had loved her daughter unconditionally, even when that love was met with defiance and secrecy. She had fought to save her child from destructive behaviors, never imagining that her efforts would lead to her own destruction. The prosecutor asked the jury to remember Ashley's face, to hold her memory in their hearts as they deliberated. Justice for Ashley meant accountability for her killer. Anything less would be a betrayal of everything she had represented. His words hung in the air like a sacred oath, demanding fulfillment. The defense rose to respond, but their position had weakened considerably over the course of the trial. The lead attorney attempted to refocus the jury's attention on her client's mental health struggles. She spoke of bipolar disorder, of mood swings that could distort perception and judgment. She described a child failed by systems that should have provided intervention before tragedy became inevitable. But her arguments felt hollow against the mountain of evidence the prosecution had presented. Under cross-examination, the defense's expert witnesses had been forced to concede crucial points. Yes, the defendant understood right from wrong. Yes, she had taken deliberate steps to conceal her actions. The insanity defense was crumbling, and everyone in the courtroom could sense it. As the defense attorney continued her closing statement, the defendant committed another act of visible disrespect that rippled through the room. She rolled her eyes, dramatically, as if bored by the proceedings that would determine her future. Murmurs erupted from the gallery. Jurors exchanged glances that conveyed a mixture of disgust and disbelief. The defense attorney faltered, clearly frustrated by her client's inability to display appropriate emotion. She attempted to recover, suggesting that such behavior was itself evidence of mental disconnect, but the damage was catastrophic. The jury had watched a girl roll her eyes during arguments meant to save her from the harshest possible consequences. Whatever sympathy remained evaporated in that single gesture of apparent contempt. The judge intervened with a tone that had grown noticeably sharper as the trial progressed. He addressed the defendant directly, his words carrying the full weight of judicial authority. He reminded her that she was facing the most serious charges the legal system could bring against a juvenile. He warned that her behavior was being observed and would be considered during sentencing if she were convicted. His reprimand was not merely a scolding but a legal statement, placing on record the defendant's continued display of inappropriate conduct. The courtroom fell silent as he spoke, every person present understanding that this judge had reached the limits of his patience. The girl's smirk faded slightly, though her eyes remained defiant. The victim impact statements that followed brought raw emotion flooding back into the proceedings. Family members took the stand one by one, each sharing memories of Ashley and the devastation her loss had caused. Her sister spoke through tears about holiday traditions that would never feel the same. A colleague described the void left in their school community, the students still struggling to understand why their beloved teacher was gone. Heath returned to address the court, his voice breaking as he described nightmares that plagued him every night. The defendant sat motionless through these statements, offering no visible reaction to the pain her actions had caused. Her indifference only deepened the wound for those who loved Ashley. Outside the courthouse, public sentiment had reached a fever pitch. Crowds gathered daily, holding signs demanding justice and shouting at news cameras. Social media exploded with commentary, most of it condemning the defendant's courtroom behavior. Legal analysts debated the case on every network, with the majority predicting a conviction. The trial had become a national conversation about juvenile justice, mental health, and accountability. And as the final arguments concluded and the jury prepared to begin their deliberations, the weight of that conversation settled upon 12 ordinary citizens. They filed out of the courtroom slowly, their faces solemn, their responsibility immense. The fate of a 13-year-old killer now rested in their hands. The jury deliberations began behind closed doors, but the weight of their task seemed to permeate the entire courthouse. 12 citizens sat around a table, surrounded by evidence binders, forensic reports, and the haunting images of a crime scene that none of them would ever forget. They had watched the security footage dozens of times during the trial. They had read the text messages sent by a girl who seemed incapable of human remorse. They had listened to expert witnesses debate the boundaries between mental illness and criminal intent. Now they were tasked with rendering a verdict that would define justice for a murdered mother and determine the fate of her 13-year-old killer. The responsibility was staggering, and every person in that room felt its crushing weight. The forensic timeline became the centerpiece of their early discussions. Prosecutors had constructed a minute-by-minute reconstruction of the morning in question, and the jury reviewed it with painstaking attention. The defendant had awakened early. She had accessed her mother's bedroom where the weapon was stored. She had retrieved the firearm and loaded it with ammunition that was readily available in the home. Each step had been captured on security cameras or confirmed through digital records. There was no evidence of panic or confusion in her movements, no indication that she was experiencing a break from reality. She had moved through the house like someone executing a plan, not someone caught in the grip of uncontrollable psychosis. The expert witness testimony was revisited and debated at length. The defense had presented psychiatrists who argued that bipolar disorder could cause episodes of impaired judgment, but under cross-examination, those same experts had admitted crucial limitations to their argument. The defendant had demonstrated awareness of her actions. She had attempted to conceal evidence after the attack. She had invited friends over in what appeared to be a calculated performance of normalcy. These were not the behaviors of someone who had lost touch with reality. They were the actions of someone who understood the consequences of her crime and was actively trying to avoid them. The jury found the prosecution's rebuttal compelling, and skepticism toward the insanity defense grew stronger. The pattern of intent emerged as the most damning element of the evidence. Jurors traced the defendant's actions from days before the attack through the immediate aftermath. They noted the voicemail recording that suggested she had contemplated violence before executing it. They examined the hidden accounts and secret communications that revealed a girl living a double life her parents had only begun to uncover. They reviewed the evidence tampering, the repositioned items, the calculated attempts to create confusion at the crime scene. Each detail reinforced the same conclusion. This was not a spontaneous act triggered by a mental health crisis. This was a plan that had been forming in darkness, waiting for the moment to emerge into devastating reality. Records presented during the trial revealed additional layers of premeditation that chilled the jury to their core. Digital forensics had uncovered search histories and deleted messages that painted a disturbing portrait of the defendant's mindset. She had researched topics that suggested awareness of potential consequences. She had swapped between messaging creating platforms in apparent attempts to avoid detection. The technical sophistication of her efforts contradicted the defense's portrayal of a confused child overwhelmed by mental illness. She had understood enough about technology to attempt covering her tracks. She had understood enough about consequences to try avoiding them. These were not the actions of someone disconnected from reality, but someone acutely aware of it. The jury observed each other's reactions as they progressed through the evidence. Some members had entered deliberations uncertain about the insanity defense. The idea of a mentally ill child committing violence was tragic, and initial sympathy was natural. But as the hours passed and the evidence accumulated, that sympathy transformed into something harder. They saw the security footage again and noted the steady hands, the calm gait, the complete absence of hesitation. They reread the text messages and felt revulsion at their cheerful tone. They recalled the defendant's courtroom behavior, the giggles, the eye rolls, the apparent boredom during testimony about her mother's death. Whatever mental health struggles she faced, they had not prevented her from planning, executing, and attempting to conceal a brutal act of violence. As the first day of deliberations drew to a close, the jury foreman called for an informal vote. It was not binding, merely a gauge of where the group stood after reviewing the evidence. The result was nearly unanimous. 11 jurors believed the prosecution had proven its case beyond reasonable doubt. One juror remained uncertain, troubled by lingering questions about juvenile culpability and mental health. The foreman assured the group that they would continue discussions the following morning, giving everyone time to reflect on their positions. But the direction of the verdict was becoming clear. Justice for Ashley Smiley was approaching, carried forward by 12 citizens who had witnessed the truth and refused to look away. The defendant's fate was nearly sealed. The courtroom had never felt smaller than it did on the morning the verdict was announced. Every seat was occupied, every inch of standing room claimed by those desperate to witness the culmination of a trial that had gripped the nation. Reporters pressed against the walls, their cameras focused with unwavering intensity on the empty jury box. Family members of Ashley Smiley sat in the front row, hands clasped together, prayers whispered under their breath. Heath stared straight ahead, his wounded shoulder a constant reminder of how close he had come to joining his wife in death. Across the aisle, the defendant sat with her attorneys, her expression unreadable, her hands folded on the table before her. The moment everyone had been waiting for was finally here. The jury filed in slowly, their faces betraying nothing of the decision they carried. They had deliberated for less than 2 days, a timeline that many legal experts interpreted as a sign of overwhelming consensus. The foreman held a folded piece of paper in his hands, the physical manifestation of justice reduced to ink and fiber. The judge called the court to order, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. He asked the foreman if the jury had reached a verdict, and the response came steady and clear. They had. The defendant was instructed to rise and face the jury, and for the first time since the trial began, something resembling fear flickered across her features. The foreman began reading the verdicts with a gravity that matched the occasion. On the first count of murder, in the first degree, guilty. The word landed like a hammer blow, sending gasps rippling through the gallery. Ashley's family members collapsed into each other's arms, tears streaming down faces that had waited so long for this moment. On the second count related to the attack on Heath, guilty. The defendant's composure cracked visibly as the second verdict was announced. Her smirk was gone, her defiance evaporated. The girl who had laughed during testimony about her mother's death now stood trembling as the weight of her future crashed down upon her. Additional charges were read and affirmed, each guilty verdict another nail in a coffin she had built with her own hands. The immediate aftermath of the verdicts was a study in contrasting emotions. Relief washed over the prosecution team as their months of meticulous work received validation. The lead prosecutor shook hands with his colleagues, his face reflecting exhaustion and satisfaction in equal measure. Defense attorneys huddled around their client, whispering urgently as she struggled to maintain composure. In the gallery, Ashley's loved ones experienced something beyond simple relief. It was catharsis, the release of grief and rage that had been building since the moment they learned of her death. They embraced each other with a desperation that spoke of shared trauma finally finding an outlet. Justice had been spoken, even if it could never truly restore what had been taken. The defendant's transformation was perhaps the most striking element of the moment. Throughout the trial, she had projected an image of detachment that bordered on contempt. Her giggles during testimony, her her eye rolls during closing arguments, her apparent boredom while victims described their devastation. All of that vanished in an instant when the guilty verdicts were announced. Tears began streaming down her cheeks as the reality of her situation finally seemed to penetrate whatever psychological armor she had constructed. She looked suddenly very young, very small, very much like the child she technically still was. But the jury had already rendered their judgment. Whatever sympathy her tears might have evoked came far too late to matter. The judge addressed the courtroom with measured solemnity once the verdicts were fully recorded. He thanked the jury for their service, acknowledging the difficulty of the duty they had performed. He praised the attorneys on both sides for their professionalism, even as the outcome clearly favored one party. Then he turned his attention to the matter that would determine the defendant's actual fate. The guilty verdicts established her culpability, but the sentence would determine how she would pay for her crimes. He announced that a sentencing hearing would be scheduled, providing time for both sides to prepare their arguments regarding appropriate punishment. The prosecution would seek the maximum allowed by law. The defense would plead for mercy based on her age and mental health. As the court session concluded and people began filing toward the exits, the gravity of what came next settled over everyone present. Guilty verdicts were significant, but the sentence would define the true meaning of justice in this case. Would the court show leniency toward a child who had committed adult crimes? Would mental illness mitigate punishment despite evidence of premeditation? The questions swirled through conversations in the hallway and across social media platforms. Ashley's family spoke briefly to reporters, expressing gratitude for the verdicts while acknowledging that their journey toward closure was not yet complete. They would return for the sentencing hearing, prepared to face the defendant one final time. And somewhere in a holding cell, a convicted killer awaited a punishment that would determine the rest of her existence. The weeks between the verdict and the sentencing hearing passed with agonizing slowness for everyone connected to the case. For Ashley's family, each day was a mixture of relief and anticipation, the guilty verdicts providing some measure of comfort, while the unknown sentence loomed on the horizon. For the prosecution team, it was a period of intense preparation as they assembled their arguments for maximum punishment. For the defense, it represented a final desperate opportunity to salvage something from the wreckage of their failed strategy. And for the nation watching from afar, it was a time of heated debate about justice, childhood, and the limits of mercy. The case had become more than a trial. It had become a referendum on how society should respond when the unthinkable happens. Media coverage reached unprecedented levels as the sentencing date approached. News trucks lined the streets surrounding the courthouse, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like technological prayers for exclusive angles. Reporters delivered breathless updates from the courthouse steps, analyzing every procedural development as if decoding ancient prophecies. Talk shows dedicated entire episodes to debating the appropriate punishment for a juvenile who had committed crimes of such magnitude. Legal experts disagreed passionately, some arguing that her age demanded leniency, while others insisted that the calculated nature of her crimes warranted the harshest possible consequences. The defendant's face appeared on screens across the country, her courtroom smirks replayed endlessly as evidence of her apparent lack of remorse. Ashley's family prepared their final statements with hearts heavy from months of trauma. They had already testified during the trial, sharing memories of the woman they loved and describing the devastation her loss had caused. But the sentencing hearing offered something different, an opportunity to speak directly to the consequences the defendant should face. Heath spent hours writing and rewriting his statement, searching for words that could somehow capture the enormity of what he had experienced. Ashley's siblings gathered to share memories and tears, crafting tributes that honored her life while demanding accountability for her death. They knew their words might influence the judge's decision, and they were determined to ensure Ashley's voice echoed through every syllable they spoke. The defense team faced the impossible task of pleading for mercy after a trial that had thoroughly demolished their insanity argument. They could not relitigate the verdict. They could not pretend the jury had not rejected their claims about mental illness, eliminating responsibility. But they could appeal to the court's discretion regarding punishment. Their strategy shifted toward emphasizing the defendant's youth and potential for rehabilitation. They gathered testimonials from psychologists who believed she could be treated and eventually reformed. formed. They prepared arguments about juvenile brain development and the capacity for change that distinguishes children from adults. It was a long shot, but it was all they had left. The alternative was watching their client sentenced to spend the majority of her life behind bars. The prosecution countered with preparations designed to ensure the judge understood the full weight of the defendant's crimes. They compiled a comprehensive account of Ashley's contributions to her community, the students she had inspired, the colleagues she had mentored, the family she had cherished. They documented the lasting impact of her death on everyone who had loved her. They assembled evidence of the defendant's behavior throughout the legal process, highlighting every smirk and giggle as proof of her lack of remorse. Their argument was straightforward and uncompromising. A life had been taken with premeditation and cruelty. The law provided for specific consequences, and those consequences should be applied to their fullest extent. Anything less would insult Ashley's memory and undermine the very concept of justice. The night before the sentencing hearing, the courthouse stood silent under a starless sky. Security personnel patrolled the perimeter, preparing for the crowds that would arrive with the morning sun. Inside, the courtroom waited in darkness, its benches empty, its witness stand unoccupied, its judge's chair a throne awaiting its occupant. In homes across the region, people connected to the case struggled with sleepless nights. Heath lay awake remembering his wife's smile, the way she laughed, the future they would never share. Defense attorneys reviewed their notes one final time, searching for any argument they might have overlooked. The defendant sat in her cell, the reality of her situation perhaps finally sinking in as the hours counted down toward her fate. Morning arrived with the inevitability of justice itself. Cars began filling parking lots before dawn. Lines formed at security checkpoints as spectators and reporters competed for limited seats. Television anchors took their positions on the courthouse steps, their voices carrying across the nation as they previewed the day's proceedings. Ashley's family arrived together, their faces drawn but determined, united in their grief and their demand for accountability. The prosecution team entered with quiet confidence, their work nearly complete. Defense attorneys followed, their expressions betraying the difficulty of their position. And somewhere within the courthouse, a convicted killer was being prepared for transport to the courtroom where her sentence would be pronounced. The judge would soon take the bench, and when he did, the final chapter of this tragedy would begin to write itself. The judge entered the courtroom with the gravity of a man carrying the weight of history on his shoulders. Every eye followed his measured steps as he ascended to the bench and settled into the chair that had become the throne of justice in this case. He surveyed the room slowly, taking in the packed gallery, the anxious attorneys, the trembling defendant, and the grieving family whose pain had brought everyone to this moment. His face revealed nothing of the decision he had reached during his deliberations. He had reviewed every piece of evidence, considered every argument, weighed every factor that law and conscience demanded he consider. Now he was prepared to pronounce a sentence that would echo through courtrooms and conversations for years to come. He began by acknowledging the complexity of the case before him. A juvenile defendant, crimes of extraordinary brutality, mental health considerations that had been raised and largely rejected by the jury. He noted that sentencing a young person required careful balance between accountability and the possibility of rehabilitation. The law recognized that children were different from adults, that their brains were still developing, that their capacity for change exceeded that of fully formed individuals. He had taken these factors seriously, he assured the court. He had consulted with experts and reviewed precedents from jurisdictions across the country, but he had also studied the evidence of this particular case with meticulous attention, and what that evidence revealed could not be ignored or minimized. The judge turned his attention directly to the defendant, his gaze steady and unflinching. He described her crimes with clinical precision that somehow conveyed profound moral weight. She had taken the life of the woman who had given her life. She had done so with a weapon retrieved deliberately from its storage location. She had fired not once but 3 times, ensuring that survival was impossible. She had then attacked her stepfather, wounding him in what appeared to be an attempt to eliminate all witnesses. And in the immediate aftermath, she had displayed behavior that suggested complete indifference to the magnitude of her actions. These were not the impulsive mistakes of a confused child. These were the calculated choices of someone who understood consequences and chose to create them anyway. He addressed the mental health arguments directly, acknowledging that the defendant had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. He recognized that mental illness was a serious matter deserving compassion and treatment, but he noted that the jury had rejected the insanity defense after careful consideration of expert testimony from both sides. decades. The evidence showed that the defendant understood the difference between right and wrong. The evidence showed that she had taken deliberate steps to plan and conceal her crimes. Mental illness might explain some behaviors, but it could not excuse the premeditated taking of a human life. The court had a responsibility to the victim, to society, and to the very concept of justice itself. That responsibility demanded consequences commensurate with the crimes committed. The sentence came with words that fell like hammer blows upon the silent courtroom: life imprisonment. The defendant would be transferred to juvenile detention until she reached the age of 18, at which point she would be moved to an adult correctional facility to serve the remainder of her sentence. The judge specified that she would not be eligible for parole consideration for decades, ensuring that the punishment reflected the permanence of the harm she had caused. He emphasized that this sentence was not delivered with pleasure or vengeance, but with solemn recognition of what justice required. A mother had been murdered by her own child. A stepfather had been wounded in an attack meant to end his life. The law demanded accountability, and accountability had been rendered. The defendant's reaction completed the transformation that had begun when the guilty verdicts were announced. The arrogance that had defined her courtroom presence throughout the trial vanished entirely. She collapsed into her chair, sobbing with an intensity that seemed to shake her entire body. Her attorneys placed hands on her shoulders in gestures of comfort that could offer no real solace. The girl who had giggled during testimony about her mother's death now wept as the reality of her future became undeniable. She would spend the rest of her youth in detention. She would spend the prime of her life in prison. The smirks that had enraged observers were gone forever, replaced by tears that came far too late to change anything. In the gallery, Ashley's family experienced a moment of profound emotional release. Heath lowered his head and wept, his shoulders heaving with the weight of grief and relief combined. Ashley's siblings embraced each other, their tears flowing freely as months of tension finally found an outlet. Friends who had traveled to support them added their own tears to the collective outpouring. It was not celebration, it was catharsis. The knowledge that the person who had taken Ashley from them would face meaningful consequences provided a form of closure that nothing else could offer. Justice had been spoken in words that carried the authority of law and the weight of moral truth. The gavel fell with a sound that echoed through the room like the closing of a door that would never reopen. The courthouse emptied slowly in the hours following the sentencing, as if those who had witnessed the proceedings needed time to process the magnitude of what had occurred. Reporters rushed to file their stories, their fingers flying across keyboards as they competed to capture the moment for audiences across the nation. Legal analysts began their commentary before the judge had even left the building, parsing every word of the sentence for significance and precedent. But for Ashley's family, the departure from the courthouse marked something far more personal than a news cycle. It marked the end of a chapter they had never wanted to live and the beginning of a new phase they were only starting to understand. Justice had been served. Now came the harder work of learning how to heal. The community that had watched in horror as the tragedy unfolded now rallied around those left behind. Within days of the sentencing, a candlelight vigil was organized in Ashley's honor. Hundreds gathered in the park where she had once walked her dog and attended neighborhood gatherings. They held candles that flickered against the evening darkness, each small flame representing a memory, a prayer, a promise to keep her spirit alive. Former students spoke about the teacher who had changed their lives. Colleagues shared stories of her generosity and dedication. Neighbors recalled the warmth she brought to every interaction, the way her smile could brighten even the most difficult days. The vigil became a testament to a life well lived, a reminder that Ashley's legacy extended far beyond the circumstances of her death. Memorials began appearing throughout the community in the weeks that followed. A scholarship fund was established in Ashley's name, designed to support aspiring educators who shared her passion for shaping young minds. Her school dedicated a garden in her memory, a peaceful space where students could reflect and remember the teacher who had believed in them even when they struggled to believe in themselves. Local businesses displayed her photograph in their windows, silent tributes to a woman who had been woven into the fabric of their daily lives. These memorials served dual purposes. They honored Ashley's memory while providing tangible ways for a grieving community to channel their sorrow into something constructive and lasting. Heath began the long process of rebuilding a life that had been shattered beyond recognition. The physical wound in his shoulder healed slowly, leaving a scar that would forever remind him of that terrible morning. But the psychological wounds cut far deeper and resisted the passage of time with stubborn persistence. He attended therapy sessions twice weekly, working through trauma with professionals trained to help survivors of violent crimes. He leaned on friends and family who refused to let him face his grief alone. Some days were bearable, others felt impossible, but he kept moving forward, one painful step at a time, because stopping meant surrendering to a darkness that Ashley would never have wanted to consume him. The school district where Ashley had worked issued formal statements acknowledging her contributions and the void her absence created. Counselors were made available to students struggling to process what had happened to their beloved teacher. Faculty members gathered for support sessions, sharing their grief while trying to maintain normalcy for the young people in their care. The tragedy sparked difficult conversations about recognizing warning signs in troubled youth, about the resources schools needed to identify and intervene before violence erupted. Ashley's death became a catalyst for policy discussions that might prevent future tragedies. It was small comfort to those who loved her, but it represented something meaningful nonetheless. Mental health advocates used the case as an opportunity to address broader societal issues. They emphasized that while the defendant's mental illness had not excused her crimes, it highlighted the desperate need for better resources and earlier intervention. Children struggling with conditions like bipolar disorder needed access to treatment before their struggles metastasized into something dangerous. Families needed support systems that could help them recognize warning signs and respond appropriately. The tragedy that had destroyed Ashley's life could serve as a painful lesson if society was willing to learn from it. Advocates pushed for increased funding, better training for educators and parents, and reduced stigma around seeking help for mental health challenges. As the weeks stretched into months, the community found itself navigating the strange territory between grief and resilience. The acute pain of the immediate aftermath began to soften into something more manageable, though it never fully disappeared. People returned to their routines, their jobs, their daily lives, carrying Ashley's memory with them like a quiet companion. The courthouse where justice had been rendered returned to processing ordinary cases, its walls no longer buzzing with cameras and crowds. The defendant began serving her sentence in a juvenile facility far from the town she had traumatized. And somewhere in the midst of all this movement forward, a fundamental question lingered in conversations and private reflections alike. What had they learned from this tragedy, and how would that knowledge shape the choices they made from this day forward? The psychological community found itself grappling with questions that had no easy answers in the aftermath of the trial. Experts who had followed the case closely offered their analyses in journals, interviews, and conferences dedicated to understanding how a 13-year-old could commit such devastating violence. Some focused on the specific diagnoses that had been raised during the trial, exploring how untreated or undertreated bipolar disorder might contribute to dangerous behavior in adolescence. Others examined broader patterns of adolescent psychology, noting the volatile combination of hormonal changes, brain development, and environmental stressors that could push vulnerable young people toward destructive choices. But even the most thorough analyses struggled to fully explain what had happened in that Mississippi home on that terrible morning. The question of accountability became a central theme in professional discussions across multiple disciplines. Psychologists debated where the line should be drawn between understanding behavior and excusing it. The defendant clearly had mental health challenges that deserved recognition and treatment, but she had also demonstrated awareness of her actions and their consequences, taking deliberate steps to plan and conceal her crimes. The jury had concluded that illness did not eliminate responsibility, and many experts agreed with that assessment while acknowledging its complexity. Understanding why someone commits violence is valuable for prevention and treatment, but understanding must never become permission. The capacity to explain behavior does not create an obligation to forgive it, particularly when that behavior results in the permanent destruction of another human life. Victim advocacy organizations seized the opportunity to amplify voices that too often went unheard in discussions of criminal justice. They reminded the public that behind every statistic about violent crime stood real human beings whose lives had been cut short or irreparably damaged. Ashley Smiley was not a case study. She was a mother, a teacher, a friend, a wife. Keith was not merely a witness, but a survivor carrying physical and emotional scars that would never fully heal. Advocates pushed back against narratives that centered sympathy on the defendant while marginalizing those she had harmed. Justice required remembering that every crime created victims, and those victims deserved recognition, support, and the assurance that society took their suffering seriously. The sentence imposed on the defendant sparked intense debate about juvenile justice policy across the nation. Some argued that life imprisonment for a 13-year-old was inherently cruel, regardless of the crimes committed. They pointed to research showing that adolescent brains were not fully developed, that impulse control and decision-making capabilities continued maturing into the mid-20s. Sentencing a child to spend most of her life in prison meant giving up on the possibility of rehabilitation before it had truly been attempted. Others countered that some crimes were so severe that age could not mitigate their consequences. A mother was dead. A stepfather was permanently traumatized. The calculated nature of the attack demonstrated a level of intent that transcended typical juvenile impulsivity. The debate continued without resolution, reflecting genuine tensions in how society balanced accountability with compassion. Conversations about the culture of violence emerged from the tragedy with renewed urgency. Commentators examined how a young person could become capable of such extreme harm, exploring influences ranging from media exposure to family dynamics to the accessibility of weapons. The firearm used in the attack had been legally owned and stored in the family home, raising questions about gun safety and the responsibilities of gun owners with children. Others looked at the role of social media and digital communication in shaping adolescent worldviews, noting the secret accounts and hidden messages that had been uncovered during the investigation. There were no simple answers, but the questions themselves felt important. Understanding how violence developed might help prevent its future occurrence, even if it could never undo the damage already done. The eternal tension between forgiveness and justice surfaced repeatedly in discussions among those touched by the case. Religious leaders spoke of the redemptive power of forgiveness, suggesting that harboring hatred only extended the suffering of those who had been hurt. Some family members expressed that they were working toward forgiving the defendant, not for her sake but for their own peace of mind. Others rejected forgiveness entirely, arguing that some acts were simply unforgivable and that pretending otherwise dishonored the memory of those who had died. Heath navigated this tension privately, wrestling with emotions that shifted from day to day. He did not know if he would ever forgive his stepdaughter for what she had done. He only knew that he needed to find a way to live with what had happened without allowing it to consume the rest of his days. The justice system had rendered its verdict and imposed its sentence, but the meaning of justice in this case remained a subject of reflection for everyone involved. Had justice been served by imprisoning a mentally ill child for the majority of her life? Had it been served by providing accountability for Ashley's death and Heath's injuries? The answer depended on perspective, on values, on beliefs about the purpose of punishment and the possibility of redemption. What seemed undeniable was that the system had functioned as designed. Evidence had been presented. Arguments had been heard. A jury of peers had rendered a verdict. A judge had imposed a sentence consistent with law and precedent. Whether that process achieved true justice or merely legal resolution was a question that would continue to be debated long after the courtroom doors closed for the final time. The courtroom stands empty now, its benches cleared of the crowds that once filled every seat. Sunlight streams through tall windows, illuminating dust, particles that drift through air once thick with tension and grief. The judge's chair sits vacant, waiting for the next case that will demand its occupants' wisdom and authority. But the echoes of what happened here will never fully fade. These walls witnessed something extraordinary, a trial that forced a nation to confront uncomfortable truths about innocence, violence, and the terrible things that can happen when the human mind turns against those it should love most. The gavel that fell on sentencing day struck with a finality that resonated far beyond this single room. It spoke for every victim who had ever been silenced. It spoke for justice itself. Remember where this story began. A 13-year-old girl sitting in that defendant's chair, smirking as prosecutors described her mother's final moments. She had laughed when she should have wept. She had rolled her eyes when she should have begged forgiveness. She had projected an arrogance so complete that even seasoned observers struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing. She believed her youth would protect her. She believed the system would see a child and show mercy regardless of what that child had done, but she underestimated the weight of evidence stacked against her. She underestimated the determination of investigators who refused to let her manipulation succeed, and she underestimated the judge who sat above her, watching every smirk, noting every giggle, preparing to deliver a sentence that would strip away her arrogance forever. The evidence had been overwhelming from the very beginning. Security footage capturing her calm retrieval of the murder weapon, forensic reports confirming close-range execution, text messages sent minutes after the attack, casual invitations to friends as if nothing had happened, attempts to tamper with the crime scene that only added to the proof of her calculated intent. The defense tried desperately to construct a narrative of mental illness overwhelming a fragile young mind, but the jury saw through that narrative. They recognized the difference between genuine psychotic break and cold premeditation. They understood that mental health challenges, while deserving of compassion and treatment, could not excuse the deliberate taking of a human life. Their verdict was unanimous. Their message was clear. Accountability would not be escaped. The judge's words during sentencing echoed with a moral authority that transcended legal formality. He had spoken directly to the defendant, stripping away any remaining illusion she might have harbored about her fate. He acknowledged her youth while refusing to let it overshadow the gravity of her crimes. He recognized her mental health struggles while insisting they could not erase her responsibility. And then he pronounced a sentence designed to ensure that the punishment matched the permanence of the harm she had caused. Life imprisonment, decades before any possibility of parole. A future defined by concrete walls and iron bars rather than the freedom she had stolen from her mother. His gavel fell with a sound that sealed her destiny and honored Ashley's memory in the same devastating stroke. Ashley's family emerged from this nightmare forever changed, but not destroyed. Heath carries scars both visible and invisible, reminders of the morning when his stepdaughter tried to end his life after ending his wife's. He still struggles with nightmares that transport him back to that moment of incomprehensible betrayal, but he also carries memories of Ashley that no violence can erase. Her laughter, her warmth, her unwavering dedication to everyone she loved. Her siblings have established memorials that ensure her legacy will outlive the tragedy of her death. Former students speak her name with reverence, remembering the teacher who believed in them when they could not believe in themselves. Ashley Smiley was more than a victim. She was a light that continues to shine through the lives she touched. What have we learned from this terrible story? Perhaps that evil does not always announce itself with obvious warnings. Sometimes it grows quietly in familiar places, wearing faces we love and trust. Perhaps that justice, while imperfect, remains essential. The system that convicted and sentenced this defendant functioned as intended, providing accountability when accountability was desperately needed. Perhaps that healing is possible even after the most devastating losses, though it requires time, support, and the courage to keep moving forward. And perhaps that we must remain vigilant, attentive to warning signs, committed to intervention before tragedy becomes inevitable. These lessons come at a cost almost too high to calculate, but refusing to learn them would compound the tragedy beyond measure. The story ends where justice demands it end, with accountability imposed and consequences rendered. A girl who laughed at her mother's memory will spend her life contemplating what she destroyed. A family shattered by violence will rebuild, brick by painful brick, carrying their beloved Ashley in their hearts forever. A community traumatized by horror will heal, though the scars will never fully disappear. And a nation that watched in disbelief will remember that justice, when properly pursued, finds its way to even the most arrogant offenders. The smirks are gone now. The giggles have been silenced. What remains is the echo of a gavel and the knowledge that actions have consequences no amount of arrogance can escape. If you believe justice was served here, make sure others see this story too. Share it with those who need to understand that accountability matters. Discuss it with those who question whether the system can deliver meaningful consequences. And let the world reckon with the truth that some crimes demand answers, and sometimes those answers come with the full weight of the law behind them. Ashley Smiley deserved better than the ending she received, but she also deserved a world that refused to let her death go unanswered. Today, that world exists, and her memory lives on in everyone who refuses to look away from the hard truths this story forces us to confront.